It's not a disease that happens to one person. It's a disease that happens to everyone. And I adored my father, so his falling apart was a very sad thing for me, and I kept trying to put him back together again.
In this episode of Insights at the Edge, my guest is Dr. Tian Dayton, a hugely accomplished person. She's an award-winning scholar and an expert on the healing of trauma, the practice of psychodrama, and facilitating healing for adult children of alcoholics. She has a PhD in clinical psychology and is a senior fellow at the Meadows. She also has developed an innovative approach for helping people work through trauma. It's called RTR, Relational Trauma Repair, and we're going to learn more about that. Additionally, Dr. Tian Dayton is the author of 15 books, including a new book from Sounds True. It's called Growing Up with Addiction: How Adult Children of Addicts Can Heal Family Trauma, Complex PTSD, and Codependency. That's a whole lot. Tian, welcome.
So nice to be here, Tami. Thank you for having me.
As a way for our listeners to get to know you a little bit more, tell us a bit about your own personal story of growing up with addiction and how that informed the writing of this book.
It has informed the writing of my life, basically. I would call us a happy, knitted, successful, resourced family until addiction slowly, brick by brick, pulled that apart. My father was an alcoholic, and he started drinking, really. I mean, quite frankly, my mother and father lost a baby, their third baby, at 2 days of birth, and in those days, you didn't mourn. She had spinal bifida. It was a blessing, all of this, but you needed to mourn also. And my parents didn't know. We didn't know about disenfranchised loss. We didn't know about any of this stuff. And my father started to drink. A friend of his said, "Why don't you just drink a little? It'll take the..." And he just drank a lot. I mean, he had an alcoholic setup. So he slowly, alcoholics, when it's only alcohol, go slowly. And the family kind of goes with them, Tami. It's not a disease that happens to one person. It's a disease that happens to everyone. And I adored my father. So his falling apart was a very sad thing for me. And I kept trying to put him back together again. Actually, I did. My publisher, Health Communications, a long time ago, did a film called The Process. And in the beginning of it, I used this Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men just couldn't put my father back together again. And that was the ICU scene and the 11 days of slow death. And that he was a house of cards falling apart. But he was falling apart many years before that. And so were we.
When you introduce growing up with addiction, you write about how some of us may recognize ourselves because a parent or grandparent were
Yes.
addicted to a substance,
Yes.
but it might be a quote unquote process addiction. And I wonder if you can just explain what that is. That's where I saw myself in growing up with addiction, with a father who I would say is a workaholic, and a mother who had challenges with overeating, and it plagued her whole life, and how that can also create some of the same patterns that we have to work with as adults.
Well, you bring a perfect example. Overeating has so much secrecy with it, and so much dysregulation, and so much preoccupation. It's what we call a process addiction, as is work, as is sexual acting out, sexual sort of, you can call it addiction, you can call it process addiction, compulsion. Uh, they're the way they happen is from the trauma perspective is that there's something inside that needs filling, something inside that needs quieting down. And for example, food, sweets, and flour are wonderful dopamine hits. So you can their dose, you can dose it right. You know when you need cookies, when you need marshmallows, when you need to stop by the place. And so there's a lot of secrecy, I would say, with both of those. The workaholic is staying away maybe longer periods of time and ignoring the family and very preoccupied. And also there's the complication of the workaholic being successful, maybe. So it's lauded in our culture. Um, does any of that sound like it
Yeah,
hits?
I think you're pointing it out, and I wanted to start here,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to begin with a quote that
Mm-hmm.
is towards the beginning of
Mm-hmm.
Growing Up with Addiction, where you write, trauma shows up less in what we remember and more in how we react. So it's how we see ourselves growing up in a family of addiction and as adults looking at our reactions to things. And I wonder if you can talk about what kinds of reactions we might have as adults where you could say, that looks to me like it might be some kind of underground trauma that's flaring.
Well, there are sort of two parts to that. One is cognitive distortions, and that is the meaning we make out as children growing up with addiction or dysfunction. We Reality is denied in alcoholic households. Reality is denied where process addictions are pretty intense. Reality is rewritten, and you are punished for. In my house, you could really do whatever you wanted to do, but if you said it, you were in trouble. I mean, if you said the emperor has no clothes, you were really, impolite, but if or mean. But if you just acted out in my family and did not good things, nobody mentioned it. Nobody addressed it. So children try to make sense of the world they're in. And the sense they make in a chaotic world where people are denying what is in front of them, where people are rewriting reality, is I must be doing something wrong. I'm obviously a bad child, or they wouldn't be falling apart like this. They wouldn't be blaming me for their moods. I must not get how to keep them happy. So those are some of the cognitive distortions. We personalize things. We make everything about me because it feels like it. And children are kind of egocentric anyway. So that's one piece of it. And the overreaction part is how the brain processes trauma. When you're Is this of interest to go into
Yes,
this?
this is a lot of
Okay.
interest, please.
Okay. So when you're terrified, which, let's face it, a little child with a raging parent is frozen and terrified, or even a chaotic environment, your thinking mind quiets down. Your hippocampus quiets down. Your limbic system, where fight, flight, freeze is, where the adrenaline rush comes, where the blood flow comes, revs up. So in these scary moments, fight, flight, freeze, fawn are the reactions that the body has, and the nervous system along with this is bracing, right? It can't breathe, it can't settle, it can't feel comfortable in relationship, it can't find the peaceful middle of anything, because there's no peaceful middle in a chaotic home. So children learn to anticipate problems. They learn to blame themselves. They learn to project their pain, make it about somebody else. They learn to feel bad about themselves and hide their shame and hide their painful feelings. So later, because the thinking mind has not made sense of the experience as a child, no one helps a child in an alcoholic home saying, golly, or the alcoholic certainly doesn't say, I must have scared you to death being drunk like that. Let's talk about it. That doesn't happen. And then the enabling parent rarely sits down and says, this must feel very chaotic to you. And more they're likely to say, everything's fine, you'll go and play, get your homework done, or, just all that kind of stuff. So because the limbic system processes emotion and records sensory data, in other words, sight, sound, smells, all of that, your body, when it's revved up, is gathering all of this sensorial data in the scene. Your nervous system is on alert. Your thinking is down regulated, so you're not making sense of what's going on. And your hippocampus is down regulated, so there's not a timestamp to the memory. There's no order because it's the hippocampus that creates context and order. What's left is a lot of emotion and a lot of potential triggered from sights or sounds or sirens or whatever, but no understanding of what's being triggered because it was never woven together for meaning. Which means when someone triggers you, you think it's the person triggering you who's causing your big reaction, and then you get angry with them. In Vietnam, in that era, if a soldier came back from Vietnam and they were in a Target parking lot and a car backfired, they hit the ground thinking, because their body told them danger was near. Their body felt the battlefield was there. For us with CPTSD, relational trauma, relationships are our car backfiring. Vulnerability, trust, need, wanting to love, feeling scared of it. So when we get triggered, it's a very vulnerable thing. And a lot of people with very little recovery just go straight for the jugular of the other person, straight for the blame. And they will say to that person all that they didn't get a chance to say to that parent, but they have no idea they're doing it. They really think it's the person triggering them, causing them the pain. They need to pull it back. They need to pause. They need to wonder what in me is such a big reaction, and they need to question themselves and get curious, really. It's quite a beautiful journey when you surrender to it.
Now, there's a lot here in what you're saying, Tian. And at one point, before you started explaining how this operates at a nervous system level, you said to me, "Are you interested in this, Tami?" And you might have asked that question because I had a kind of blank look on my face. And I want to speak to this for a moment because sometimes, and I noticed this in reading growing up with addiction and in listening to you now, when I hear somebody saying something that's really important and kind of getting under and into my nits and grits, I can kind of go into a dream place a little bit where my mind isn't as sharp, but I'm sort of in a dreamy kind of timeless strange zone. And I wonder if you can speak to that to whomever might be listening to our conversation. And as you're talking, they're noticing different kinds of responses that are coming up for them, maybe like the one I'm sharing or maybe something different.
Well, you know what you're reminding me of in psychodrama, which is what I do to heal people. We have something called a psychodramatic trance state. And here's what I believe that's a repatterning brain state. And if I may be personal, you are a famous meditator and spiritual person. And that part of your mind you might have more access to than the average person, and less fear of just allowing it to kind of reflect and go back and see what might be coming up and wonder about yourself. I don't know if I'm hitting anything accurately.
I think you're saying something really important. And what I really want to drive to in this conversation is the repatterning, the possibility of repatterning. And I'm gonna start here by reading a quote from Growing Up with Addiction. And it has to do with when we don't feel safe. Like you gave the example of someone coming back from Vietnam, hearing a sound in a parking lot and hitting the floor. So
Mhm.
different people may experience triggers in different ways, but in that moment, they don't feel safe. And you write, healing isn't about convincing yourself that you're safe. You
Right.
can't just think your way out of complex PTSD because trauma isn't a story in your mind. It's stored in your body, your nervous system, and the reflexes that activate before you even have time to think. Trauma lives not just in memory, but in muscle, fascia, breath, and heartbeat. Beautiful writing there, Tian. So,
Thank
my
you.
question to you is if we can't talk ourselves into feeling safe, what can we do so that we have a sense of calming ourselves down in order to engage in the kind of repatterning that you're saying is possible?
Well, I feel like I'm sitting in a long line of spiritual people in listening to you, including yourself. And so breath, you start with the breath. Uh, if you can come back to the breath, and just do even breathing, you're going to start to make the sympathetic and the parasympathetic more even, which will calm your nervous system. And that's that yoga breathing, you know, uh, alternate nostril. But any breathing will help. As you, one thing I learned, observed in meditating early on in my 20s is that the mind has its own capacity to heal itself. That if you sit long enough in meditation, your body will, in its stillness, produce what needs to come up. So I think if you, just as you did, I'm guessing, right now, sit with what's coming up. That's what most people don't want to do, is just sit with what's coming up and wonder about it. It's the questioning, the curiosity, the evaluation, the talking, the telling a story that's sort of distant is now what helps us heal. It's allowing the body to feel safe enough to connect feeling to sensation, a word or feeling to sensation. And that is what I do in RTR is create experiential moments so that as feeling arises, you can hang with it a little bit. And then you name that, and suddenly it gets a little more spacious, and you're in a room of other people doing a similar thing. And they're kind of in the same place, and then you translate it into words and share it. So it's a very simple process of learning emotional literacy, because what your body is shutting down, it's now getting open to, and the mind is coming out of the body then. Bottom up healing. It's the reasoning, the thought, the piecing things together is coming from the body. And then the kind of the witnessing mind is making sense of it as it arises. And it's oftentimes a kind of, because trauma is a fragmenting experience, the sights are here, the sounds are there, the person is there, the situation is sort of foggy, you can't quite remember it. This is very simple process, but it heals trauma because trauma fragments, and sitting with and observing and making sense of heals. And it heals very well in co-regulatory fields with other people, which is, Steve Porges, I'm sure Steve has been with you. The first time Steve polyvagal theory saw floor chicks, he said, This healing is through co-regulation. I think, religious places, temples, 12-step meetings, people are healing through a kind of a limbic resonance and a co-regulation. And horses do it too. Herds do it. Your limbic system starts to vibrate outward a little and you regulate each other. So there is the healing that happens within the self. And then there's the healing that happens within a community. And then in a 12-step room, for example, you hear like-minded people share kind of in the same area you're struggling, maybe. So then you learn to listen without shutting it down, jumping up, arguing, because there are ground rules.
Tell me more about the kind of co-regulation that could happen, for example, in a 12-step group. Because I could imagine someone who hasn't participated in such a group saying, great, I'm with a bunch of people who are messed up like I'm messed up. How is that actually going to, quote unquote, co-regulate me?
Because it's not about the story. It's about the capacity to sit with the feelings, for lack of a more complicated, it's just the capacity to sit with what you're feeling and translate it into words so it can make it from the body to the mind, and you can share it with yourself, reflect, share it with another person, and then listen to what they have to say. So it's a simple process, but it's amazing how many people can't let it happen. Yeah.
What is going on when we name it? Because I know that's one of the first steps that you have in name it and then reframe it. But just in naming it, why is that so valuable and beneficial to us?
Well, I don't know if it's the naming or the there's such an emotional unconsciousness that happens with trauma. You become a stranger to yourself. I mean, if you can't allow yourself to feel what's inside of you, or you've got to call it something else because it was unacceptable to call it what it was, then getting in touch with the feeling that's coming up through your body and saying, that feels like my anger. That feels like my anger. It's not, at this moment, I'm not going to make it about somebody else and say, are they angry at me? That's a common thing we do. Or I've done that. I mean, sometimes I think people are angry at me when I'm angry at them, So, uh, so you're naming it to get it into the right place. And that's a little bit of liberation. But then you're also getting curious about what's inside of you. And once you can put words to feelings and feelings to words, you can start to fit them together and put together fill in the gaps, put the pieces of the puzzle that got fragmented through trauma. And keep in mind, I think, that in families where there's trauma, nobody's talking to each other about that. They're talking to each other about everything else. So it doesn't get resolved in just having a good cry or good talk. It just sits in the system, in unconsciousness, unnamed, unnamed freight.
Now, you developed a method, relational trauma repair. Why did you feel, first of all, that a new method was needed? Like, what was missing out there in the field? And then describe to us, what is relational trauma repair?
I'm a psychodramatist, and psychodrama really healed me. The minute I think I was 30 when I experienced my first psychodrama, and I just thought, whoa. And then
Can
I
you
tried,
explain for people who are
oh,
unfamiliar what
sorry.
it is? Yeah, it's okay.
Psychodrama is a role-playing method developed by J.L. Moreno and later continued to develop with his wife, Circa Moreno. And it is talking to, not about. This is the whole beauty of it. It's embodiment. For example, instead of if somebody's in my office and they're talking about their mother and got a lot of thoughts about them, a lot of thoughts, and the story gets maybe a little complicated and it gets maybe a little tangential, I might say, if she were sitting in that chair, What would you say to her? And then, because it's a direct encounter, because you're talking to and not about, your body comes in. You're less separated from your body in the story in your head. And suddenly you're saying what you mean, not what you think you might mean if you were, but Mom, why didn't you see me? Why didn't you like me? Why didn't you? And then here's the key, which is sort of the sine qua non of role reversal, is reverse roles. And then you become the mother, talking back as the mother to yourself. And this is paradoxical. You'd think you'd leave yourself and have less of it. But actually, by becoming more flexible in your role repertoire, you learn empathy for your mother because you're standing in, it's not an act of will, the empathy. You're embodying her. You suddenly realize, wait a minute, everything wasn't about me. She was scared to death, you know? She made it about me, or I made it about me, but it was about so many other things, her history, just by sitting in her. So these simple role plays are very curative and reframing. The reframing's in the process.
Okay, well, hold on, because I really want to put this under a magnifying glass for a moment.
Mm.
What 30 years ago, when you engaged in a psychodrama practice and you said it changed you, it healed, what happened? Take us to that place.
Good
What occurred?
question, because something very specific happened. Sharon Wegscheider Cruz, who was then kind of a pioneer in the ACOA and codependency movement, came to our house. I was always trying to get my family to get help. So we corralled everybody who was older than 8 or 10 and all went into the basement for 2 days. And just that was pretty amazing in and of itself. But Sharon said, okay, sculpt the family, choose people to play the family members or use the real people as you see it. And first of all, the question for me was mind-boggling, and I get to see it my own way. So there was the liberation of just knowing we each live in a different family. We each see it differently. And then watching all my family members sculpt their version of the same family was profoundly liberating for me because it gave me permission to have a different experience. And we were on our way to move to London at the time. And I remember getting there and just thinking, wow, it's a whole ocean. This is a perfect amount. This is the boundary I've been needing, an ocean. And it just kind of catapulted me into my own ability to leave a system because it coalesced the system in front of my eyes. So I could
Okay.
see it as dysfunctional
Okay,
and wonderful.
that's helpful. And in
Mm.
terms of this role reversal practice, if somebody wanted to try this, what would you suggest? How might they be able to try this even on their own as a way to look at a situation differently?
Okay, so I would put like on cigarettes, caution, this may be,
Sure.
but as long as that's it there, talk to the chair. Or talk to a part of yourself. If you're struggling with a frozen part of yourself, mentally place that part of yourself in a chair and just talk to it. In other words, I see your frozenness. I see your struggle. I I don't know what to do with you. You've got me stuck. And then tell yourself reverse roles and go and sit in the frozenness and talk back to yourself. And you will find that part of you having a voice. Because as frozenness, I will surprise myself. I'll say, well, you never took any interest in me before. I've been serving you all your life. What would you have done if I weren't here freezing for you so you could just go to school and have lunch and go on parties and so on? So to get that kind of a dialogue with an internal part of self is very releasing. Or you can do it with somebody else. You can talk to your dog. You can talk to, I love psychodramas talking to
And I
dogs.
do. And they talk
Yeah.
back too.
Yes, exactly. Their dogs are there all the time.
Okay, now I want to go back to the creation of
Why did
relational
I do that?
trauma repair. Yeah, why you did it. And also for
Mhm.
people who are like relational trauma, is that different than other kinds of trauma? Just
Right.
explain that as well.
Yes. There's event trauma and there's relational trauma. Event trauma is the car accident. Event trauma is the attack. Event trauma is the momentary rage. Event trauma has a beginning, middle, and an end, generally speaking, and that is PTSD. And the remarkable part about it is because of the way the body stores traumatic memory unconsciously, it doesn't have a label, it doesn't have a connection, it's never been made sense of. Event trauma goes into a you know a dead zone, and then that's why you can get triggered, and that's the post part. Days, months, years, decades later, you can explode because your body gets triggered and still not know why you're exploding. So that's the post-traumatic stress reaction. The CPTSD is relational. That's when your parents are it's the drip, drip, drip of criticism. It's the expectations that are cruel. It's the all that doesn't allow you to be you and to be comfortable and to feel safe. And or it's the if you think of a baby in your arms, a baby, all a baby wants is you. All a baby wants is to connect. And if you disconnect, that is a traumatic experience for the baby. It, when you, for your listeners, Ed Tronick, as this wonderful psychologist, did something called the still face experiment. The still face experiment. Google it. In 4 minutes, you'll change. When you see what it does to a baby, not to be mirrored or seen. And then you want to go back to why did I start this particular model? There was a I work in the addictions field, and people don't have the training to do psychodrama well usually, but addicts and people in recovery, codependents, love psychodrama, love the way it feels. But you need to do it pretty well to have it work in the addictions space. And I knew, and plus there were budget cuts in New York in the 80s. All my trainees were coming and telling me they had groups of 30 and 35 people, and they were supposed to give them therapy. This was the managed care phase. So I really thought I know sociometry. That's the kind of group dynamic, concretized part of Moreno's triadic system. What can I do to extend sociometrics that I love but aren't good enough? They don't last long enough. They don't do enough. So I came to a group with feelings all over pieces of paper. And I just invited everybody to walk over to a feeling that they were experiencing. In other words, I had to come up with something that could give therapy to 35 people. And the only way you can do that is by mobilizing the group. And I knew I had to find points of connection. So I had to find a way so there was common ground on the pieces of paper, and that people would walk over to a feeling, share it, and then the people around them would be their links. They would be healing each other over common ground. And they would be hearing each other. They'd be on different pieces of paper all over the room. And then it incorporated movement because I got people out of their chairs. If you work in a treatment center, people are coming in like this, and so I got people out of their chairs choosing. That was a big thing. I got the body moving. So that meant the limbic system and the emotional and sensorial system was waking up. And then it was a simple thing. What are you feeling now? So that's a choice that names it for you. And then all you have to do is share why you chose it, which is emotional literacy in the making. Then you listen as other people do, and you don't leave the room and you don't argue with them and you don't throw something. And all of this is healing, and it can last for 45 minutes. And then I started in treatment facilities. They do psychoeducation. We do psychoeducation, which I love. It's so respectful. Um, So I just put it all on the floor. Instead of putting symptoms on a chalkboard, which makes everybody think they have everything, I put them on the floor and gave them a choice. Which one do you identify with? Which one do you not identify with? Which one did your family struggle with? So that's intergenerational. That's family of origin work. Uh, this little simple process was not simple at all. And it could sustain a group of 35 and they would heal each other. And to watch it happen, and I have watched it now in, most of the cities in the country and Europe, and it works the same every time. And it works with 1,000 people and it works with 10 people. It's people healing people. You just have to have the structure so the brain can relax and the body, the nervous system can predict.
I pulled this headline out of Growing Up with Addiction: name it, reframe it, rewire it. And in our conversation so far, I think we've talked some about having enough awareness to name what you're feeling, the reactivity, how that might have been something that came from your family system. But I want to understand more. You shared a little about how your own experience helped you reframe your childhood growing up. You could see it from lots of different perspectives. But
Yes.
this reframing and the rewiring in particular, I want to
Hmm.
hear more about.
Well, the reframing in psychodrama and in RTR happens through the process itself. Through role reversal, you're reframing it through casting your version of the family and watching others cast theirs. You're putting things in perspective. You're giving things different frames. It doesn't have to land in one frame, though it probably, I mean, there's the reframing would be a process, seeing it differently, becoming more flexible in your perspectives, but getting out of your own head and being able to see from other points of view. And then the rewiring, the neurobiology, we sort of think we're all wired when we get here, but babies, in fact, they're not fully wired at all in their nervous systems when they're born. A lot of the neurological wiring for emotional regulation occurs outside the womb. So that is why this kind of rocking and touching and cooing and skin to skin is not just a nice thing for little babies, it is a crucial part of how they wire their emotional balance. And if they don't get it, they are dysregulated. They
Okay,
if they're
so let's talk to the dysregulated listener who is joining us. They're identifying with that. And I think they understand, Tian. I think what you're saying about breathing as a way to regulate their nervous system when they don't feel safe. But the patterns that were formed early on seem pretty well worn. It doesn't seem easy to repattern. And so this, from your experience, I know you have so many years of experience working with people in the addiction and the trauma healing field. This is what I want to learn more about.
it's a deep and important and core question. Uh, there are a lot of ways to regulate a nervous system. And I think you have to do them all the ones that work. Pick the ones for you, whether it's biking or nature or walking with a friend or doing breathing or meditating or all of the above, eating regular healthy food. Uh, it's a discipline. It's a new design for living. It doesn't just happen. And people get frustrated. People want to think ACOAs and people with trauma want to think themselves better. It's just marvelous. Why am I still reacting for my mother? And they want to come for a week of treatment and be done. And that is not how it works. It is a learning to live differently. So the first place you need to learn to live differently is in your own body. You have to start letting your body talk to you. And self-care, rest when you're tired, listen. If you're being with people you don't want to be with, pull back a little bit. If you're doing things you don't want to do, try to uh, stop doing as many of them, or find an attitude that can give you a better chance at doing them with pleasure. Um, it's a long question, and it's emotional literacy. It's getting in touch with your body. It's retraining your nervous system. It's accepting yourself, and it's some discipline.
It's interesting to hear you use that word, because I don't know if I've ever heard anyone exactly talk about healing as a discipline. And so tell me why, you use that word kind of tentatively, but yet you're also making a point in a strong
Yes,
way.
yes. Well, treating so many ACOAs and addicts and so forth, there's a time in recovery. I mean, I don't do the initial. I consult in programs that do that initial month of I obviously work and have worked there, but primarily I work outpatient. The initial recovery is just regulating the nervous system and starting to open to the idea of change. And good treatment centers feel like bubbly. I mean, they're backslapping, volleyball, tears, laughter. They really let the nervous system start to relax and sound like humans. Um, but what you just said, well, the discipline, right? So, but there's a point, and it's frustrating, and that might be why I'm having a hard time getting the words out. It's very frustrating as a therapist to hear people say things like, why haven't I changed? Why haven't I gotten better? Why? And what I really want to say at that time, and occasionally do, is find the best feeling you can find. Make it your job to live a good life. Make it your job to pay attention to the thoughts you're thinking. Pay attention to the way you're seeing the world and seeing yourself, and develop better attitudes, develop clean morals, develop all the kinds of simple things that create happiness. And it's often stability. It's often having a good moral compass. It's often being regular. That's the kind of thing 12-step does for people. When people think, oh, it's the God thing, or oh, no, it's good orderly direction and support along the thing. And I think also, Tami, it's a spiritual awakening. I personally think, I mean, if I'm going to be really
Please lay
open,
it out. Don't hesitate.
I think God is everywhere. I think to deny God is to deny the self at some level. I mean, to be able to live in this universe we live in and not wonder about the intelligence that's created it. And who cares if it's a God or a million intelligence? Who cares? It is something beyond understanding. And I think there is a kind of awakening that happens through meditation, some people get it through drug experiences. I kind of worry that that's coming back as a part of the therapy. I'm not sure what I think of it, but I perfectly okay if it opens a door that you will discipline yourself to stay in that room. So I think disciplining yourself, if you have an awakening, then know that you're capable of it and find it sober. If you let yourself go down a rabbit hole of negativity, find a way not to. Find a way not to. You know, if you are if you just kind of accept the mean side of you and find a way to be nicer. I think people are just happier when they take ownership of your own negativity, take ownership of your own darkness, and mine it. I had a trainee come in today who's doing RTR. and they work with an Orthodox Jewish community. And he said he's got this wonderful accent. People in his community say, I don't want to open this can of worms. And he said, what can of worms? It's your can of gold. And I was just stunned at what he said. It's Jungian. It's the gold is in the shadow. Mine your own shadow. Get to know this side of yourself. Accept that it's there and grow it up. Grow it up. Enlighten it. So that's what I mean by discipline. I don't know that that's a very satisfactory answer, and it's
It's
maybe
a
why I don't
terrific
talk.
answer. It's
Oh,
actually
good.
really, and I would say it's a tough love answer. And I like that. I like that. To be honest, it's the kind of tough love I need to hear. So I'm grateful to you, Dr. Tian, for bringing it. I mean, there's like, why hasn't this method worked? Why hasn't that worked? Come on, why haven't you person? This kind of
Exactly.
blaming. I'm going to blame all the
Yeah.
talented therapists I've worked
Yeah.
with, and right, but you're just putting it right back on our power of choice. I want to go back to earlier in our conversation, and you wrote in Growing Up with Addiction, you started the chapter and you said, if you don't get anything else from this book, read and reread this chapter. So I
Yeah.
sat up straight and I was like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm going to pay very careful attention here. And you wrote about how trauma can make us prone to cognitive distortions. And you've shared a little bit about what some of those cognitive distortions might be. It's all my fault when something happens, or one of my cognitive distortions is I'm going to blame XYZ person now very strongly before I even think about it, something like that, like being quick to blame. But the interesting thing is in the same chapter, you talked about somatic distortions.
Yes.
And this I found extraordinarily interesting. So why don't you help bring our listeners up to speed here on how if we grew up with addiction, that could create somatic distortions in how we receive the world.
Well, I was sort of making up a category because cognitive distortions are the thoughts and the personalization and the black and white thinking that comes out of a dysregulated nervous system. We think, feel, and act in dysregulation. And I'll come back to that. But I was once giving a talk and I think, in Canada, in Vancouver, in fact. And there was this huge, I'd done a book called Emotional Sobriety, and I was trying to describe what that was to 200 or 300 people. And finally, out of sort of desperation, because they all looked blank, I said, it's like emotional sobriety is living in 4, 5, and 6. It's like dysregulation is going from 0 to 10 and 10 to 0 with no speed bumps in between. So that's dysregulation. That is, ground zero of cognitive distortions. And that is a somatic distortion because it's a nervous system dysregulation. So the nervous system patterns out even more strongly and then our thoughts follow. Starts in the body. So if your somatic distortion is that when you are around conflict, you start to freeze, then your body is remembering how it handled that conflict and it just goes there right away. And the path out of it is pretty easy. It's just creating willingness. It's pretty easy. You just have to sit there and go, oh, I'm freezing again. Why am I freezing? Why am I freezing in this situation? And then try to stay out of the blame, which is like really challenging because, of course, you want to say, I'm freezing because you're this and that. But it's really, why am I reacting like this? Because I'm the only one I can change here. And that's where the liberation is. What's going on in my body that I can own and translate? What's going on in my mind that I can own and translate? So even if this other person doesn't change at all, I will have some consciousness around what's going on with me. And once you get that consciousness, and it's often historical, you'll often go back to, gosh, my mother made me so terrified all that time, or I felt so criticized by her, or you'll find out why you're so triggered. And then the beautiful thing is it will kind of lift. And that person isn't changing at all, but you see them differently. You just see them differently because you've made sense of it. And you've made sense of it starting with your body, because your body doesn't lie. And it will follow the same path until you wonder about it. And what will come out of that somatic distortion is the thought distortion and the behavioral distortion.
Right. You write in Growing Up with Addiction about how we can understand triggers as teachable moments. So for those of us who find ourselves and we can say, oh, I know that's when I was triggered. How could we make it a teachable moment?
Really, because once you're in a triggered state, the window is open. Stuff is starting to come out of you. What you need to do is not throw it at the other person, and take a pause and say, why am I reacting like this? Why is my reaction to this not very big exchange enormous? And there will always be a reason it's enormous. If triggers are overreactions, so they are based on a past that is not staying in the past. That's the hippocampus brain part again. The brain doesn't organize memories so that it has a past, present, and future. All the memories are on top of each other, mixed together, undifferentiated. So I use timelines to get that clear, so that you can start
Teach
seeing.
me more about that and how I might be able to use a
You use a
timeline
timeline.
practice.
You know,
A little example.
little example, when Bessel's work was coming out in the 80s, and I was putting it in with psychodrama in my head. How is this working together? But my clients, when we were talking about trauma, just kept fogging out. When we would talk about what happened that hurt, it became very obvious they had what was then thought of as memory loss. I have now come to think of it is just unconscious stuff that hasn't ever been reasoned through and put into order. So it acts like memory loss, but the memories are all still in there. That's why they're giving you a problem. Once I asked people, so I started saying, well, put a timeline, take a piece of paper, and on the long end of it, divide it by 5, and just enter in what you remember that happened, that either was terrifying or that was a dynamic, or so covering both event and relational trauma. And as people did that, the fog started to lift. It's a very simple act, but it starts to put things in order, which means your nervous system can start to see some structure. Your brain can start to see some structure, and everything isn't just piled up over, one period. Another thing people would observe are things like, well, gee, I had so much trauma in these young ages, and then nothing bad really happened between this age and this age, but I felt bad all the time. Well, that's when you can't resolve something, it's still living inside of you with all of the cognitive distortions and all of the reactivity and all of the fears. So that's why you want to process as you go. Or people would get through recovery. And I remember, one of the most interesting observation was, since I entered recovery in my 40s or whatever this person was, I've had trauma, but I don't register it as trauma because I'm processing it as I go. So you want trauma to have a beginning, middle, and an end. It doesn't, but a timeline will help achieve that. And it will help the brain relax and restore order and put things in the past that are in the past and in the present that are in the present. So they stop seeming to be the same, which is the core of the overreaction, that the past is intruding on the present. The past is coming out as an overreaction in the present, but it's from the past, but it's getting pinned on the present. And it really screws up people's present lives because they really are convinced.
When you go to create a timeline, and let's say you're working on what happened from conception to when you started talking. So you're in this pre-verbal period.
Mm-hmm.
What part of you is filling out the timeline at that point? Like you're
Well,
imagining that this happened, or
the group helps a lot in that. I love doing this in a group because then I stretch it out on the floor, put 0, 5 to cards on the floor, and I just say go to an age where you're still frozen, where you still have work to do. The babies, when they're going to each other, the toddlers, when they're going to each other, talk to each other. So they start to hear what they're sharing and things clear up because together they're making sense of their own youth. So that if you don't do it alone, it's much easier. If you do it alone, you have to just be a little more relaxed about what doesn't get entered into that timeline because a person by themselves just may not be able to recall.
no, you mentioned, Tian, that the people who have suffered from addiction love the embodied sculpting and
Hmm.
psychodrama work in particular. Why is that?
The nervous system relaxes because trauma is disembodying. When you freeze, when you flee, when you fight, flight, freeze, fawn, even is a disembodied experience. You're in your head. You're trying to read everybody else, and you've left yourself, and you're in your head trying to stay safe, and you're managing other people, but you're forgetting about yourself. You're forgetting about yourself. You're not in yourself. So psychodrama has a role that is you. I mean, you're sitting there as yourself, and then you're reversing roles with another part of yourself or another person, and then you're returning to yourself. So that in and of itself is restorative. Just to inhabit on the stage, or what we call a stage on the floor, the role of self.
So another curiosity, this term that you coined, relational reliving. Help me understand that more. Okay, now my follow-up question to your very good answer was, how can we become more aware when we're in a relational reliving moment? How can we have more awareness of that ourselves?
That's a good question. Uh, I think it becomes a habit to question yourself. So I think as much as possible, be willing to see what you're bringing to the party. Before you react, take a pause. Or more often what happens, Tami, is you react, more often with me it happens, I will react, but then I will think, why am I so heated up? Why is this grab? I mean, what a signal for me is I if I have to talk to my husband about something that's going on like 15 times, eventually I started thinking, gosh, maybe I'm bringing something from my past. Maybe this is triggering something in me. Um, if the person who's triggering me is not such a huge part of my life, but they can really get under my skin, that's historical triggering. So what is required of me is that I take a pause, that I become willing to see what it is, that I sit in that uncomfortable moment with self where I'm just going, it's just her. It's just her. I'm sure, if she should stop doing this, I would stop feeling like this. And just say to myself, okay, just for a minute, wonder if there's an historical piece here. And then, of course, once you're willing to wonder, it comes.
Okay, one final question for you. I don't know if I'll ever make it to an RTR, experiential psychodrama, but I want to gain some of the value. And in your book, Growing Up with Addiction, How Adult Children of Addicts Can Heal Family Trauma, Complex PTSD, and Codependency, you offer a lot of different practices that someone could do on their own. I wonder if you can share one final example here with our listeners that they can work with as part of a way of furthering their own healing process.
So I hope it's okay if I name three because three are popping into my head. One
Sure.
is letter writing, one is timelines, and one is social atoms. And they're all in the book. And it's described how to do them. The social atom will give you, the reader, a sense of the system you grew up in or the system you want to create, but it will give you the role relationships. The timeline will help you put things in order, but also in order with yourself. In other words, who was I when I was 3? Who was I when I was 7? What do I want to say to that person? You can do that empty chair exercise and talk to the various parts of yourself, reverse roles, or you can write a letter. That's the most easily available. And it is 2 roles. It's the writer to the part of self or to the other person. And it's remarkable how much direct encounter you feel writing a letter and how much relief. It's quite wonderful. And you can share the letter not with the person you wrote it to, but with a friend or a partner or whomever is near that you trust. And it's very evocative because, again, you're talking to and not about. To, not about.
I've been talking with Dr. Tian Dayton. She's the author of the book Growing Up with Addiction: How Adult Children of Addicts Can Heal Family Trauma, Complex PTSD, and Codependency. Thank you, Tian, for this deep conversation. Brought up a lot, and for your terrific suggestions for the path through.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.